Good early morning, everybody. It's Lorraine, Alternative Homesteading, on October 30th, 2025. And it's the 30th rather than the 29th is because I have had no internet at all since yesterday at 3:30 p.m. until now. I've got zero internet connection. And ironically, on Monday, when the internet went out early in the morning, it came back on at 3:30 p.m. So anyway, yeah, and that just the way it works here in Jackson County, Kentucky. You know, it's the Freemason town of Jackson County, Kentucky. Everything works on 33s. So yeah, so from 3:30 p.m. yesterday until currently, I have no internet connection. I called the local internet company twice and filed a complaint. They didn't mention that there are any outages around here. Only mine. So anyway, I want to continue reading little snippets from the book Chameleo, A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security by Robert Guffey. And this book is copyright 2015, so it's 10 years old, and it discusses a lot of different things about mind control, invisible little people, gang stalking, street theater, and more. So I'm going to go back and forth because I've got little pages marked off with some interesting things that are here. So, at the beginning of the book, the way it starts out is that there is a man named Dion. So in case I mention his name, D-I-O-N, that most of what is happening in the book, it revolves around. So the person that is speaking about the book is a friend of his, and he's relaying information about his friend Dion. And it starts off as, my friend Dion first told me about the invisible midgets in the summer of 2003. Invisible midgets. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. And what happened was, he would have a lot of people coming and going from his apartment, you know, to stay over. Some of them were drug addicts, etc., etc. But there was this one kid, he said, he was different from all the other drifters who had stayed at the apartment before. His name is Lee. Lee had recently gone AWOL from nearby Camp Pendleton. He had taken with him 25 pairs of night vision goggles, a 9mm pistol taken from the body of a dead Iraqi general, a DoD laptop, an entire truck. How such a feat was possible in our post-9/11 lockdown society is beyond me. The truck was not stashed at Dion's apartment. The other 3 items, however, were. Lee had the goggles, 3 or 4 pairs, at least, stored in the trunk. Dion perpetually buzzed out in his mind, didn't think that there was anything odd about any of this until one day he saw the DoD logo appear on the kid's laptop one evening. July 18, 2003 to be exact. That's when the seriousness of the situation dawned on him. So this is how people get caught up in being tracked, harassed, being placed in the program. So this guy Dion invites people into his apartment. Some of them are addicts, but this one kid named Lee, he disappeared from a local Camp Pendleton, and he stole all of this military equipment and brought it with him. And it actually baffles the mind that that much stuff could disappear, and how that was possible. How could you misplace a truck? How could the military misplace a truck? So anyway, so going on, it says that Lee had these goggles, and he goes on to say that he says they can't turn that on in here. They can track that shit with satellites, but they'd be here within seconds. So he was concerned with all this military stuff in his apartment that he was going to be tracked. I mean, he's an addict. He knows he's been in and out of jail, so he knows how this is a possibility. And then Lee, the military guy, waves his hand and says, "That's bullshit. They can't do that." Dion and a bunch of other people watched as the kids scrolled through a whole series of files marked top secret and above top secret. The file names were so technical sounding that Dion had no idea what they meant. And as a whole, the files seemed to be a field journal written by a team of intelligence specialists stationed at the Gulf. Lee opened some of the files and laughed while pointing at top secret blueprints for machines Dion didn't even know existed. He got really pissed. Dion got really pissed off. He says, "F this. You've got to pick your stuff up and get the F out of here." He was scared to death because he was afraid that the feds would show up. You know, they tracked this stuff. But Lee refused to go. And then at that point, there was a knock on the door. A very officious sounding knock, and all the people on drugs at the party, at the permanent party froze while Dion opened the door. A middle-aged woman flashed a badge and identified herself as Special Agent Lita L. Johnston of the Naval Criminal Investigative Services. That is the NCIS. Two men in black types stood behind her. "We have reason to believe you have stolen military equipment stored on the premises," said Lita. "We're going to search your apartment." Well, it goes on to say, he says, "Do you have a warrant?" They didn't have a warrant, so they had to leave and come back with a warrant. But by that time, Lee was gone, and he took most of his stuff with him. So I'm going to fast forward here. Now, on July 12th, 2003, I, meaning the reader, the person telling the story, who they call him Mr. Big, on July 12th, 2003, I became initiated into the 3rd degree of Freemasonry at the Torrance University Lodge number 394. How I drifted into Freemasonry is a weird and complicated tale. It's best left for another time. The only reason I mention it now is because it plays an important role later on in the book. And I didn't get to that important role in the book yet. So I'm going to fast forward. He goes on to say later on, is history repeating itself? Orwellian surveillance tactics exploded in the wake of 9/11 terrorist attacks. The order of the day was to round up martyrs, no holds barred. Was it so possible that an innocent at least, person being accused for a crime that he didn't commit could get caught up in a net through a simple, stupid error? An average Joe is assassinated by a government task force because of a simple bureaucratic error. The word Tuttle is transformed to Buttle due to the corpse of a fly mucking up the inner workings of a typewriter. And that's what ended up happening. The government task force screwed up because of a bureaucratic error. So anyway, he was suspicious about his friend Dion because, you know, Dion was stoned out a lot of times, but he noticed that there were a lot of these little people following him. He'd find shadows of people in his apartment. And it came to the point where it just was too much of a coincidence and happening too frequently for it to be just something normal. It wasn't normal. So it turns out that these cars that were following him, he collected all the license plates, or whatever plates that were possible. He would just walk right up to the back of the car while the driver was still sitting inside and meticulously jot down the numbers. So he collected a bunch of them, and he noted the type of vehicle that it was. So he says, in order to put this to the test, I gave the numbers to a friend in Seattle who turned around and gave them to a guy he knows who works for the DMV. And in his spare time, this guy at the DMV ran all the numbers, and none of the license plates had ever been issued. Is that interesting? So this is what you would expect from a government vehicle. Automobiles used in covert affairs like this are never listed in the DMV files. There's no way to explain the non-existence of the license plates except the exclusion that Dion was being followed by the government vehicles. So now I believed him, kind of. He wasn't merely suffering from meth-induced insanity. That much had been proven. So now what? What the F could I do about it? So his friend, Dion's friend, Mr. Big, the one who is writing this book, his ears are perking up. He's got military experience, and now he's become a 3-level Mason. His ears are perking up because what his friend Dion is telling him is no longer suspicious. It's no longer drug-induced. It is becoming suspicious. So Dion kept telling him about these weird little details. That at one point he was in his bathroom getting something out of the medicine cabinet when he caught sight of one of the little effers, he calls them. That's what I call them the little effers too. It's the little effers. Just for the split second that it took for him to open the cabinet door, he spotted a little man in the background standing only about 10 feet behind him. So Dion started opening and closing the mirror on the cabinet door like crazy. So Theodore Surgeon, a science fiction writer, said, always ask the next question. If someone had an experimental invisibility suit based upon light-bending technology, it made some sort of cockeyed sense to me that the suit might become visible temporarily while the mirror was in motion. So that's what Dion was doing. He realized that there were these little invisible creatures, and he finally caught sight of one after he had opened up the mirror on the vanity in the bathroom. Another detail he noticed was that occasionally parts of the little people became visible. It was depending on the background, a vague outline would appear represented by dots of light floating in the air. They looked something like auras. Flashes of lights made me think of a visual phenomenon that people report while hallucinating. Not long after the invisible midgets started showing up in the apartment, that woman, the special agent, Lita Johnston, she made a return appearance. She was polite and friendly, asking how Dion was doing. But then she asked him if he changed his mind and would like to tell her where the goggles were hidden. Evidently these goggles were so important. And I don't know if you've seen that film. You see it every once in a while. You see clips of this guy putting on sunglasses, taking them off, and when he would put the glasses on, he would be able to see the demons in certain individuals who would be walking on the street. He would be able to decipher who was real, like a real human, and who was demonic. Now, something else had happened. Now, again, think military experiments, military-grade technology. And this is in somewhat response to Mike's testimony that he posted a couple of days ago about his brother appearing larger and then smaller sometimes. So now he goes on to say the room started growing. Dion called me one afternoon several months after this whole mess had begun to tell me that early in the day he had entered his apartment through the front door and was surprised to see that the living room appeared far larger than normal. He said, "This house is evil, and it grows." At this point, I thought he definitely lost his shit. Until a couple of days later, the place does look like it's bigger. And he asked, he said, "Does this place look larger to you?" He says, again, "I did not have the technical logic to explain such phenomenon, but I knew it was not a typical Dion hallucination, you know, when he's drug in stupor. None of these symptoms were familiar. I've known a lot of drug addicts in my life, and not one of them ever hallucinated that their apartment had transformed. And no one ever shoots heroin and dreams that the domicile has become a grandstand for Doctor Who's Who, TARDIS. Heroin and meth aren't even hallucinogens. And Dion despised hallucinogens. Always had. So the fact that his house was growing, these goggles are missing, he's got the feds showing up, something is going on here. He considered that this was like some kind of a virtual reality mind F. Now keep in mind that this little virtual reality scenario is important because the scene didn't appear to be a mere two-dimensional painting. It really looked real. It's almost as if Dion opened the door and stepped into it. The scenery remained this way for hours and then it morphed into something else. This continued for several weeks. Dion is freaking out. He's getting nearer to the edge. Like, he's like, what the hell is going on here? My apartment is growing and getting smaller. It would morph into something else, like a virtual reality scene. It was driving him crazy. He goes on to say here, imagine a ridiculous college fraternity with the resources of the entire black budget of the United States of America deciding to play one long prank on one faceless guy in San Diego. And imagine that faceless guy is you. It might seem it's absurd at first until you start to lose your mind. The military types who were parked in the lot outside, they never left. One time Dion got so fed up he called the cops just to see what would happen. So now 2 cops show up. One young kid, he seemed interested in Dion's story, while the older cop kept implying that the gentleman who was parked outside, they weren't really there at all. They were gaslighting. Obviously part of the program. The young kid just really looked confused, as if one cop were in on the joke and one was not. Perhaps it was just a classic good cop, bad cop, but who knows? The point is that Dion could not seek help from law enforcement, as they had clearly been told to allow this operation to continue. Keep that in mind, for all the people out there, including myself, that file police reports and they do nothing. They had clearly been told to allow this operation to continue. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. So they're having a conversation, and he's so confused how the government could be spending so much money to put these little invisible people around him, etc., etc. Like, how is this possible? So here's the comment. You see, every year the government gives us a certain amount of money, and if we don't spend it, then they'll take it away from us next year. So we've got to figure out a way to spend it. Now, we don't really need an English tutor. I mean, we don't have that much demand for one, so pretty much no one's going to come in. You can just sit in the back of the room and do your homework or read or whatever, and you'll still collect a paycheck. I mean, we've got to unload this money somehow. So why not on you? Like, why not on you, a targeted person? Why not on me? So the reason they are still following you, they're claiming, has to do not only with the goggles, but the fact that the government gives us a certain amount of money, and if we don't spend it, then they'll take it away from us next year. Now let me fast forward here again. Let's talk about street theater. There was a man named Walter Bowart, B-O-W-A-R-T. He was a font of valuable information. He had been researching mind control for almost 30 years. I knew him fairly well for several years before his death from, get this, colon cancer in December 2007. We even collaborated on a feature-length play, including The Other Crusades. It was Walter who directed me to a website called raven1.net, where he discovered a brief article all about street theater by Eleanor White. The article was described in great detail how everything Dion had undergone during the past few months. Street theater. It is a feature of the organized stalking with electronic harassment scene. Street theater is activity performed by persons complicit in the electronic weapons harassment, but they're skits, as opposed to direct bodily attacks performed with the electronic harassment equipment. These skits are designed to imitate the little breaks of normal living. They're only performed in such a way that only the target would know they're being harassed, but cannot convey to others that this is indeed harassment. Well, that's not true, because when I lived at 52 Sutton Drive, Manalapan, New Jersey, home I lived in for 30 days as original owner, my mother would come to visit, and my mother obviously knew what my house looked like before and after the damage, and about the new neighbors that had moved in and stuff. Well, she would come to visit me a couple of times a month, so I could go out and leave my house with having somebody in the house. She noticed as soon as I would leave, a whole bunch of people would exit their doors, including my neighbors. And they would be motioning to people down the street. My mother did notice this. So no, I was not crazy. It really was happening. So, additionally, they only performed in such a way that only the target would know they're being harassed, but they can't convey to others that this is indeed harassment. Feelings of hopelessness, that everyone's against me, is one apparent purpose of these skits. What is impossible to convey to people who are not targeted is that what is different about the mind weapon research skits is the quantity. When you encounter normal breaks of life, several times a day, every day, you're no longer talking about normal. Several breaks a day of a type which you might expect maybe every couple of months is not natural or random. But trying to explain this to someone who is not targeted, difficult. Another purpose of these skits is to discredit and isolate the victim so that others will regard him or her as a crank or nutcase when the target complains. These are far from simple pranks or practical jokes. These are skits that provide a mind weapon researcher with extremely good cover. If the target is ever coerced into contract with a psychiatry, the psychiatrist's legal powers of imprisonment without the process of law dramatically increase and reinforce the isolation and labeling of the target. Many people know in advance what they're experiencing and will discredit them. So although street theater seems to have a comedic ring to it, this component of organized stalking is one of the most serious forms of attack on individual targets and the perfect cover for the perpetrators. So I'm going to end here. There are several things that they mention about damage to your clothing or furniture. They would find bizarre food, loud noises. At the supermarket checkout line, you might find somebody reaching into your shopping cart to remove an item, to force you to make another trip to the store prematurely. The number of variations of these street theater skits is designed to wear you down and be unlimited. After the events of 9/11, these acts of domestic terrorism on innocent civilians increased 1,000-fold. For some of the victims, the reason was obvious, while in some other instances, the impetus for the stalking seemed random. So I'm going to sign off for now. Thank you everybody for subscribing. Remember to hit the notifications bell so that you're notified when there's a new video. Leave your comments down below. I appreciate that. And share if you're inclined to do so. And I will talk to you guys soon.